Well, welcome to the 700 Club. President Trump has issued an all-caps warning to Iran. Never, ever threaten the United States again. That tweet comes as a response to a statement from Iran's President Rouhani, who said war with Iran would be the mother of all wars.
Well, these fighting words come as the United States prepares to resume economic sanctions against Iran because the Trump administration has pulled out of the controversial nuclear deal. Amber Strong has more.
A war of words erupted over the weekend between President Trump and Iranian President Hassan Rouhani. Rouhani sending this message Sunday: America should know that peace with Iran is the mother of all peace, and war with Iran is the mother of all wars, Rouhani said. One newspaper reading, Mr. Trump, do not play with the lion's tail. Wasting no time, the president firing back late last night. Never ever threaten the United States again, or you will suffer consequences the likes of which few throughout history have ever suffered before. We are no longer a country that will stand for your demented words of violence and death. Be cautious. The battle between the U.S. and Iran reignited after the administration's decision to depart from the Iranian nuclear deal and reimpose sanctions against the regime.
The fact is, this was a horrible, one-sided deal that should have never, ever been made.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu praising the administration's tough stance.
For years, this regime was pampered by the powers, and it is good to see that the United States is changing this unacceptable equation.
Speaking before an Iranian-American group in California, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo criticizing Iran's leaders for oppressing its people and ignoring their needs.
The level of corruption and wealth among Iranian leaders shows that Iran is run by something that resembles the mafia more than a government.
And in Iran, months of protest over economic hardships and frustration with leadership.
The proud Iranian people are not staying silent about their government's many abuses. And the United States, under President Trump, will not stay silent either.
The U.S. has vowed to back the Iranian people. Amber Strong, CBN News in Washington.
Well, here's what's really going on in Iran. The news media is not publicizing this as much as they probably should. That is that these are protests against this government. They're saying we don't want it anymore. And here's something very unusual. In the streets of Iran, just the past few weeks, we've heard chants of death to Palestine. Now, we're all familiar with Iran saying we want to wipe Israel off the map. We want to destroy Israel. We're going to have mock battles, taking the Temple Mount, all of these kinds of things. So the level of unrest, the level of rejection of the current regime, to reach the level of death to Palestine being chanted in the protest. So that's what's going on. When you see that, you then need to understand the regime is fearful, and they think that they're getting ready to be deposed. And so what are they going to do? They're going to create an enemy. And guess who that is? Well, that's you and me. So when President Rouhani is starting to sound like Baghdad Bob, remember him from the Second Gulf War? He was saying how we were going to greet American soldiers with bullets, and there isn't a single American soldier in Baghdad, all those kinds of things. It's the same behavior pattern. It's because they're in trouble, and we're getting ready to see something I never thought we'd see in my lifetime, a change in Iran. Could there be a true democracy established there? That would be something to pray for, and that would be something wonderful. Well, between Iran, North Korea, and Russia, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has a full plate. Recently, he told CBN's David Brody about the one issue nearest and dearest to his heart. John Jessup has more on that story from our CBN News Bureau in Washington.
Thanks, Gordon. Secretary Pompeo will host the first ever worldwide conference on religious freedom right here in Washington this week. In his recent one-on-one interview with David Brody, Pompeo said his Christian faith explains why this issue is so important to him.
Unfortunately, religious persecution is nothing new, and in recent years it's grown. In an attempt to stop that trend, more than 80 high-level government ministers will come together to promote religious freedom. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo tells CBN News it's a major priority for this administration.
The advancement of religious freedom
matters to every individual in every country. The human dignity, the human right attached to religious freedom, I feel personally, I know President Trump does as well.
The overall concept is to show evidence that greater religious freedom means less terrorism and a better economy. Experts say roughly 3/4 of the world's population face some restriction on religious freedom. As for Christians, 1 out of every 12 experience extreme persecution in the most dangerous countries on the State Department's worldwide watch list.
Not every country will achieve the level of religious freedom that we have here in the United States, but we think we can advance it all across the world by bringing together folks from all faiths, and frankly those who have no faith. But their capacity to practice religion in the way that they choose is important for the world.
For Pompeo, this is also personal because his evangelical Christian faith compels him to take action.
Your faith, I know, is very, very important to you. You've talked about this in public before. So why this seems, there's the public policy aspect, but it's also personal.
Look, it's very consistent with what the Trump administration is trying to achieve with respect to religious freedom. But it also fits with my worldview. I'm an evangelical Christian. I know that not everyone shares that faith, but it's important. It's important not only that Christians, but people of all faiths have the capacity to worship in the way that they desire.
One of the biggest offenders is North Korea, and Pompeo already has his hands full there, negotiating with Kim Jong-un to get rid of his nuclear weapons.
We need to see Chairman Kim do what he promised the world he would do.
North Korea's human rights record is just as suspect as their inaction on nuclear weapons. The country ranks #1 as the most dangerous country for Christians. While Secretary Pompeo wouldn't reveal his conversations with Kim, he did make one thing very clear in our interview.
I want your viewers to know that the United States rarely has an encounter with a country where we don't raise human rights concerns where they exist. We know the history there in North Korea.
And the U.S. hopes to write a new chapter with this historic conference to stop religious persecution and make a difference around the world. David Brody, CBN News, Washington.
Thanks, David. And today, America's United Nations Ambassador Nikki Haley sits down to talk to David about religious freedom, support for Israel, and how she's working to make changes at the United Nations. Be sure to watch Tuesday's 700 Club for that story. Well, as America faces an unprecedented number of cyber attacks, the nation's top cops who are working to stop them are retiring. At least 5 of the FBI's top cyber agents have left or are leaving the agency, many for the private sector. This comes as senior intelligence officials warn that the United States is at a critical point in the international cyber war. The FBI constantly battles ongoing attacks by countries like Russia. Their departures also come as the FBI faces ongoing scrutiny by President Trump. Well, a woman who miraculously escaped from a sinking duck boat in Missouri last week called on Jesus to save her. The boat set out in near hurricane-force winds. 9 members of her family were on the boat, including her husband and 3 children. The woman and her 13-year-old nephew were the only family members to survive. Coleman says the captain told them they wouldn't need their life jackets. The grief-stricken mother says she can't imagine her home without the sound of her children. The National Transportation Security Board is investigating the tragedy. Well, in Nicaragua, pro-democracy demonstrators are crying out for help. They say for 3 months the government has resorted to violence and murder to stop them. And in an exclusive interview with CBN News, the Nicaraguan president's stepdaughter says the world is finally seeing the true nature of Daniel Ortega. Gary Lane has a story.
This is a scene all too common in Nicaragua. Another funeral for a victim of recent political violence. At least 280 people have died in the past 3 months. And now the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights says the government has violated human rights. The UN Commissioner on Human Rights says most of the deaths have come at the hands of police forces and pro-government groups, including allegedly the use of snipers that have led to the wounding of at least 1,500 people.
The gravity of these developments may well merit an international commission of inquiry.
Protests began when the government made changes to the country's social security system. They soon grew into deadly clashes between pro and anti-government forces. At recent anniversary festivities marking the Sandinistas' communist revolution, President Daniel Ortega told a crowd of supporters, quote, "As Christians, we are obliged to tell the truth." He urged the crowd to turn against the, quote, "satanic, murderous sect of believers opposing him." But demonstrators say roaming government-backed paramilitaries are the ones doing the killing. They're targeting peaceful protesters and Christians for attack. They're also kidnapping pastors and vandalizing churches. The unrest comes of no surprise to President Daniel Ortega's stepdaughter, Zoila America Ortega Murillo, who now lives in Costa Rica. She suggests Nicaraguans are tired of government corruption, and she says her stepfather is an immoral man. In 1998, Zoila America went public with allegations that Ortega sexually abused her when she was 9 years old.
Everybody was defending Daniel Ortega because of his power. But when I discovered that I really was a child of God and that from him I can start a new life and a new birth, in this moment I understand that God is the perfect father.
And now, 20 years later, she says Nicaraguans and the world may finally believe she was sexually abused by the Sandinista leader.
The Nicaraguan people is starting to a process of awakening to knowing who is Daniel Ortega really, and maybe now they can say, yes, Daniel Ortega is capable of making sexual abuse too, because he's an abuser. At the beginning, abusing a girl, and now abusing a country.
Gary Lane, CBN News.
Thanks, Gary. Israel carried out a bold nighttime rescue operation Sunday inside Syria. More than 400 Syrian aid workers and their families were brought to safety in Israel, then sent to Jordan. The so-called white helmets risked being killed if they stayed in Syria. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says Israel answered the United States and Canadian calls to help them.
A few days ago, I was approached by President Trump, Canadian Prime Minister Trudeau, and others with the request that we help hundreds of white helmets get out of Syria. These are people who have saved lives and whose lives are now in danger. I authorized bringing them through Israel to other countries as an important humanitarian gesture.
The IDF has also helped Christian ministries giving aid to Syrians injured in the civil war. Gordon, unsurprisingly, the Assad government is calling this a criminal operation.
I'm not surprised that they would take that view, but isn't it wonderful what Israel has done? Here are the white helmets, famous documentary on their efforts, and they're just trying to help people. They're trying to pull people out of buildings that have been bombed by their own Air Force, and they're just trying to help. But in that, they've run into the ire of their own government, and Assad is looking to kill them. So what a wonderful thing for Israel to do, to have the capability to go into Syria, to remove them safely. But this isn't new for Israel. They've been helping their neighbors for a long time. Here's a small country, it's just the size of New Jersey. But since 1980, they've reached out with humanitarian aid to over 140 countries around the world. What a wonderful thing, what a wonderful example. And truly, they are being a light to the nation.